So today's Amud is Daf Yudal Amud Beis. It's a new Gemara, so it's not connected to before. You don't have to be up to date on what's going on till now. It's a new Gemara, totally unrelated to what we learned earlier. So the Mishnah spoke the second half of the Mishnah, the second piece of the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, "Atami sha'achal es hakodesh v'abal hamikdash tameh." There's Makkos for a tameh who eats a tameh, like a person who eats kachim. By the way, that could be either kohen, who's eating the kachim which arrives to the kohen, but of course it would be a yid. A yid has shlamim. A yid can, the balama, eat certain kachim, so he's not allowed to eat it when he's tameh, right? And the tameh sha'achal es hakodesh is allowed, and there's kares as well. And this goes, like we said earlier, this goes according to Mandama, the chayvi creases also get malchus. So that's one. And then the Mishnah says, "V'abal hamikdash tameh." That someone who comes into the base hamikdash while being tameh, also there's a malchus for that. So the Gemara over here is going to discuss these two cases. Daf Yudal Amud Beis, we're up to, it's quite a bit down the Amud already. 2 dots, maybe 10 lines from the top, a little bit more. 13 lines from the top. The tameh sha'achal es hakodesh, right? We're going to be talking about tameh sha'achal es hakodesh. Tameh who ate kachim gets malchus. So the question is, where's the azhara? But just before we start, I just want to give a little bit of introduction. There's a lot of backwards and forwards with psukim over here. So what you have to remember is that there is an issue of eating kachim while tameh, which is what the Mishnah is discussing. There's also an issue of touching kachim while you tameh, the Mishnah doesn't talk about, but the psukim going to be used to be darish that. There's an issue with the tameh eating truma, and there's the issue with the tameh touching truma. And besides for those 4 cases, there's also a discussion with the tameh eats kachim, whether the isser is only la'achaz rika or also lifnei zrika, whether the lav and the lav is also is la'achaz rika or also lifnei zrika. Okay, so let's see inside. So the Gemara goes like this: Bishleim habal hamikdash tameh. I understand the case of habal hamikdash tameh, someone who comes to the base hamikdash while being tameh. Ksiv oynesh or ksiv azhara. I have in the pasuk both the oynesh and azhara. I have the pasuk where the pasuk tells me the punishment for someone who does this, and I have the azhara, which means where the Torah tells you you're not allowed to do this. Right? Every single oynesh, ein oynesh and kin masir. You need the Torah needs to tell you 2 things: number 1, the punishment, and number 2, don't do it. By lavin, it goes together because every don't do is an automatic malchus, but you always need an azhara to say you're not allowed to do something. So by abal hamikdash tameh, you have the oynesh, you have the azhara. Where do you have the oynesh? The oynesh dichsev es mishkan Hashem timei v'nichrasa. The oynesh you have, it's right. If you look in Torah Oyer Shalem base, yeah. The pasuk says, "Kol negeh b'meis b'nefesh." The pasuk Parshas Chukas this week. It's negeh Parshas Para this week. We're learning. So the pasuk says, "Kol negeh b'meis b'nefesh adam asher yama." Someone's tummy maze v'lo yischatan, and the pasuk says, "It's mishkan Hashem timei." If he's metameh the mishkan by going to the base hamikdash while he's still tamei, v'nichras nefesh om Yisrael. It's kares. So we have the oynesh of kares. Except mishkan Hashem timei v'nichras. So azhara, where's azhara? The azhara we also have from below yitam was machneh. The pasuk says is a lav. That this is a pasuk which talks about tzarua and a zav, someone who's a metzayir or a zav or tami meis. The pasuk says, "Mizocha nekevet shalechol michutz l'machnes shalf," and that to go out of the machnes. The lo yatamus machneh is allowed. They're not allowed to be metamed the machnes, meaning they're not allowed to come into the different machnes. So from there we learn that you're not allowed to come also into the right, depending on the tumah, you're not allowed to come into different machnas, but definitely you're not allowed to come into the Beis Hamikdash. That's everyone's not allowed, all the different levels. So when the pasuk says v'lo yitamas machneim, that's allowed to say that a tumah is not allowed to come into the Beis Hamikdash. So that's all with regards to habal hamikdash tumah. But the question that the Gemara is going to ask now is elo tumah sha'achal es hakodesh. But the case of a tumah eating kachim, we know the oynesh, but we don't know the azhara. Bishleima oynesh ksiv. The oynesh we have a pasuk like tumah sha'achal es hakodesh. The pasuk says. Look at her dalet. That's a pasuk. Someone who's tameh, Tomas Oliver, he's tameh and he eats shlamim, he eats karbanas at the time of being tameh. The nichras is karetz. So we have the oynesh. We know the pasuk says he's chayav karetz. B'shlem oynesh ksiva nefesh sheteicha basim mizavach hashlam Hashem Hashem Tomas Oliver nichras. Al azhara min ayin. Where's the azhara? We don't have any clear, explicit place where the Torah says, "Don't eat kachim while being tameh." No maferish pasuk, and therefore it's got to be differently modim. So Rish Lakish Aimer, the Gemara Taka answers, the Machlekes Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, right? Rish Lakish Aimer b'chol kodesh leisiga. The pasuk which says that don't touch kachim, and we understand at this stage that the pasuk doesn't mean don't touch kachim, but rather the pasuk is saying don't eat kachim while being tamei. What's the pasuk? The pasuk is it's talking about a yulada, so the woman who's tamei tumas yulada. Then it continues, you're not allowed to, while tamei, literally touch kachim, but Rish Lakish understands this to mean, and the Gemara is going to elaborate on later why it's coming to explain why it's after talking about eating kachim and not touching. But at this stage, the Gemara understands it to mean to only referring to eating kachim. Means you're not allowed to eat kachim while you're tamei, and this is the lab. Rabbi Yochanan says I have a different way of learning out that a tamei is not allowed to eat. That a tamei is not allowed to eat kachim. That a tamei is not allowed to eat kachim. What is that? Rabbi Yochanan Tani Bardla learned Asya Tumase Tumase. Just a second, let's turn my phone up. So Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Bardla, Tani Bardla Shem Chacham, I guess. He learned Asya Tumase Tumase. It's Gzeir Shava Tumase Tumase. What's Pshat is Gzeir Shava Tumase Tumase? It's Ksiv Hachab Tumase Olav Nichasa. The pasuk which talks about the pasuk which talks about this is the pasuk of the oynish. The oynish for Tami Sha'achlet Zakaidah, which is a beferish pasuk. There it says the lashon v'tumasai olav v'nichasa, the word v'tumasai. Uksiv hasam over there by a Tamish. The Tamish who came into the base Hamikdash, right? So there too it says the same lashon Tamayia oy tumasai by. Pasuk which we first started off with, right? The pasuk in Kukas, which says you're not allowed to come into the base Hamikdash, and if you do, you get kares. There it also says tumasai. So mal halon einish vazar, afkan einish vazar. There's tumasai said by the Baal Hamikdash Tamei in the context of kares over there. There's the word tumasai which is said in the case of a Baal Hamikdash Tamei with regards to the einish. So even though there's no azhara, but since it says tumasai by both places, so we learn that just like by the just like by the Baal Hamikdash Tamei, there's someone who comes into the base Hamikdash while being Tamei, there's an oynish as well as azhara. So to obey, even though the azhara isn't clear, but we learn out of the Gzei Shav, it's as if there's azhara. That's Rabbi Yochanan says. So to summarize what we said so far, Rabbi Yochanan says from B'chol Kodesh Lo Yisigo, we know that Tamei cannot eat kachim, and Rabbi Yochanan says it's Gzei Shav Tumase. Just like by Tumasai, there's just like by the case of a Habal Hamikdash Tamei, it's where it uses the word Tumasai, there's a Beferish Hazar, you're not allowed to do that. So too, Tami Shachas HaKodesh, even though it doesn't say clearly, but the word Tumasai teaches me that whatever applies to Baal Hamikdash Tamei applies to Tami Shachas HaKodesh as well. Period. So now the Gemara tries to understand why Rish Lakish doesn't say like Rabbi Yochanan, why Rabbi Yochanan doesn't say like Rish Lakish. The Gemara says Bishlem Rish Lakish Le'amak Rabbi Yochanan. It's very understood why Rish Lakish doesn't say it like Rabbi Yochanan, because we know Gzeir Shav is either you have or you don't have them. Either you were Makabel Gzeir Shav from your Rabbi or not. So it's very partial. We can say the reason why Rish Lakish Le'amak Rabbi Yochanan Gzeir Shav Lo Gomer. He didn't learn this Gzeir Shav of Tumasi from his Rabbi, and therefore he has no Makkos to set from the Gzeir Shav to say that the Tamesh Achales HaKodesh is Azhara, don't do it. So therefore, he has to say it's from B'chol Kodesh Leisiga. But the question the Gemara is going to ask now is, Rabbi Yochanan, my time Rish Lakish. Why did Rabbi Yochanan not say like Rish Lakish? What says B'chol Kodesh Leisiga, which is understood at this stage to mean that you're not allowed to eat kachim, not just touch kachim. You're not allowed to eat kachim while being tummy. Why doesn't Rabbi Yochanan use that pasuk out? Why does he have to come to the Gzeir Shava? So the Gemara answers, Amalecha hu azhara litrum. He says that no, the B'chol Kodesh Leisiga is not azhara. He's not allowed to say that a tamei is not allowed to eat kachim. Rather, it's allowed that a tamei, it's allowed to tell you that a tamei, a person is not allowed to eat truma, right? And there's no, even though kachim is usually more chamor, there's einoin shemin adin, so eimazir min adin, there's no, you can't make such kavachayim. So he basically says, I only have azhara for truma, and therefore kachim he learns out of Gzeir Shav. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, B'chol Kodesh Leisiga is talking about truma, tamei not being allowed to eat truma while being tamei, and according to Rish Lakish, is not to eat kachim. And Rabbi Yochanan learns kachim from the Gzeir Shav. Fred the Gemara Rish Lakish as hard truma minole. Okay, if Rabbi Yochanan is using the pasuk of B'chol Kodesh Leisiga to tell you you're not allowed to eat truma while being tamei, where does Rish Lakish learn that's hard truma? So my answer is nafkalei from a different pasuk. Pasuk says, easy to vav. Yeah, ishish mizer aron behut sarua is all, but kachim lo yoichal ad hashayita. Right? It says clearly, but kachim lo yoichal ad hashayita. Could be used for kachim. We'll soon see why it's not used for kachim. But Rish Lakish says that this kachim over here is referring to truma, but kachim le'echa doesn't refer to kachim, refers to truma, and that's what we have that hara truma from. Rish Lakish is hara truma. And after me ishish mizer am behut tzrua izal, b'chulu in other words, b'goymer, yeah. And as the passage continues, b'kachim lo. How do you know he's talking about truma? Of course, the passage is talking about kachim. So he says like this: Ezu davashu shove bezari shel Aaron. He says ishish mizer Aaron. Doesn't say koyanim.
says anyone mizera Aaron, which includes both men and women. What is something which is shava bezari shel Aaron? In other words, it's shava by zari shel Aaron, bein anoshim, both by men and women. Have oimezu truma. I'll tell you that it's truma. Chachim only men can eat. Even the chazan shah, even the other types of kachim which women can eat, not all women. The almano grusha v'zera einla v'shavel beis when she goes back to her father, she can only eat truma. She can't eat kachim. So the most inclusive thing that is shayah to almost all the zera of Aaron, I say almost all because if the daughter of a Klein marries Yisrael and is still married to Yisrael, so that she can't eat truma even. But any woman who's got a shaychus to kohuna, she's not married to Yisrael, can eat truma. Even an almana who goes back to her father's house. So ezu dabasha ushava bazar shlan haba imezu truma. Since it's ishish mizera Aaron, we see we're talking about something which is unique to the zera Aaron. That only and zera Aaron means both men and women. What is something which is unique to zera Aaron, both men and women? Truma. And therefore he understands that the pasuk v'chol kachim l'yoyf ishish is mizera Aaron is coming for truma. As horror the truma, you're not allowed to eat truma while being tamei. And therefore he has the pasuk v'chol kodesh le'siga spare for kachim. So now the Gemara asks for idach, meaning what does Rabbi Yochanan do with this pasuk of ishish mizera Aaron? If b'chol kodesh le'siga is for truma, then what's ishish mizera Aaron? And the Gemara hu la'achila v'halin gia. Very pashat. He says b'chol kodesh le'siga he takes on kipshutay. B'chol kodesh le'siga means you're not allowed to touch truma. Ishish mizera Aaron b'utzaroi zav tells me you're not allowed to eat truma while being tamei. So it comes out at this stage Rabbi Yochanan doesn't have any pasukim for kachim at all. You're not allowed to eat kachim. Sorry, he does have. He has Gzei Shavat Tomasa, but he doesn't have a pasuk. He's not allowed to touch truma, touch kachim. Sorry, he has a pasuk for touching truma, while being tamei. He has a pasuk for eating truma while being tamei, which is a pasuk ishish mizar Aaron. Rish Lakish is the other way around. Rish Lakish has a pasuk to tell you about touching kachim while being tamei, but he has a pasuk that you're not allowed to eat kachim, and he has a pasuk for truma, not eating truma, but he doesn't have a pasuk for not touching truma while being tamei. Okay, so that's so far. That's all. Maybe we'll pause over here and do some Rashi. Let's pause over here and do some Rashi. So Rashi from Elaz Haraminolo. So straight right. So what's the Rashi going on? Rashi is going on the original question. The Mishnah said Tami Shachal Sakaydis is allowed. You get Makkos. Besides for the cars, you get Makkos. So you need a lamb, you need someone in the Torah where it tells you not to do it. So the question is, Al-Azhar Minol, and where's it from? So straight away, Rashi's bavaning the obvious. Rashi's bavaning the obvious question. What do you mean? Why do I need a pasuk? The kachim loyoichal is a mefurish pasuk. The kachim loyoichal, which we see later on in the Gemara, ish mizera Aaron b'utzru azov the kachim loyoichal, which is ultimately used for truma. Why doesn't the Gemara understand that that's kachim straight away? So Rashi is negating and saying you can't say that because of the context, as we see later in the Gemara. But Rashi is going to spell it out now. You can't say it's from the pasuk of kachim loyoichal. The loymayri b'kachim ele b'truma, because that's not talking about kachim. It's only talking about truma. How do you know it's only talking about truma? The ksibbe ish mizera Aaron dava shava b'zar shel Aaron, something which is equal b'zar shel Aaron. By all zar shel Aaron, there's both men and women. You know, it's both men and women allowed to eat truma. In general, so it's coming to tell you don't do it while you're tamei. The afa chizeres, even a chizeres, meaning an almana and a grusha, the zera einla, someone who's married to Yisrael and then got divorced or widowed, and she goes back to her father's house. Truma is inclusive that even the chizeres who can't eat kachim anymore, but she can eat truma. Okay, so what does the pasuk Taka say? Taka says that according to Rish Lakish, we learn out of the pasuk that you're not allowed to eat kachim while tamei. Rashi explains that later on we're going to learn it's talking about Ashar La'oichel. As Rashi is bothered by the same question that you would be bothered by, which is the Chor is talking about touching. So with the Ashar La'oichel, Gemara later on is Dorish that primarily the pasuk is talking about not eating kachim. Tani Ba'adila, Shem Chacham. Siva Tumasi, all of this is Rabbi Yochanan. How the Rabbi Yochanan knows that Tami Sha'achal HaKodesh is the lav. There's a Ashara for that. It's from the Gzei Shabbos Tumasi. With Tami Sha'achal HaKodesh, it says the word Tumasi Allah. Okay, so he has a Gzei Shabbos. Why does the Shach not hold like Rabbi Yochanan? What's wrong with Rabbi Yochanan's Gzei Shabbos? So Rashi Gemara explains Gzei Shabbos loy gama. The loy lamda mirabbe. Rashi explains loy lamda mirabbe. He didn't learn it from his Rabbi. So Shabbos bezar shel Aaron. So now we continue to say that how does Rish Lakish know it's Harlit Truma from Ishish Mizar Aram Utzarua, where it says the Kachim Lo Yoichan, it can't be talking about Kachim literally because of has to be something which is Shava Bizarre Aram, but Noshim and Noshim, but Kachim ain't on the call another far. Kachim Taka, first of all, Kachim are only eaten by male. The Chitay make a Chaz V'Shaik, if you're going to tell me there is the Chaz V'Shaik, which the Noshim can eat. Less of the Chayzer is going on the Grush Bizarre. Let's you're really repeating what he said earlier, but spelling it out a little more, that even the Chaz V'Shaik doesn't apply to all women, because the Chayzeres, Almano Grusha, who goes back to father's house, doesn't eat Chaz V'Shaik. And Almano Grusha V'Zara Eino Damamach Chayzeres the Truma Veinu Chayzeres the Chaz V'Shaik. She can eat Truma again, even though she couldn't while she was married to the Yid, to the Yisrael, but she's not Chayzer the Chaz V'Shaik B'Hakim Parshin L'Bivonis. I think who has Har Truma, although is Taka going on the following Gemara, even though we've mentioned the same word, but this who has Har Truma is going on the next Gemara. So okay, so what do we have till now? Just because it's a little bit complicated, we have like this. Rish Lakish uses the word B'chol Kodesh Leisiga to tell me you're not allowed to eat kachim while being tamid. From Ishis Mizera Aaron Butzuruzah but kachim layoika, he says to him Truma, not even Truma while you're being tamid. Rabbi Yochanan uses those two psukim both for Truma, one for eating, kachim layoika, and B'chol Kodesh Leisiga for negia. Of the pasuk. And so where does Rabbi Yochanan learn tamid that you're not allowed to eat kachim from the Tumasi Tumasi? Yeah, right. Shlakish learns kachim from the Kodesh Leisiga, not to eat kachim. You soon see why. What about touching kachim? And with regards to Truma, he learns out Ishish Mizar Masura Zavla Yoicha. Taka doesn't have a limit for negia of Truma like Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says both psukim, one is negia, both Truma, one negia, one eating. And the pasuk, and where do we know that? Our mission is then that Tamisha Achas HaKodesh is belav. That's from the Gzei Shabbat Tumasi Tumasi. Says Tumasi Ba'al Amigdash Tami, says Tumasi here. Just like over there, there's Azhara. So even though here there's no spelled out Azhara, we don't have Gzei Shabbat. It's as if there's Azhara written. Okay. Weiter in the Gemara. Reading Gemara Kasha, Rish Lakish, Hai B'chol Kodesh Leisiga La'achdu Da'as. So we've established that B'chol Kodesh Leisiga, according to Rish Lakish, is coming to tell me that Tami is not allowed to eat kachim. B'chol Kodesh Leisiga, you're not allowed to eat kachim while being Tami, even though it says Leisiga. Okay, we'll deal with that soon. So now the Gemara is going to ask a kasha. Does Rish Lakish really say that B'chol Kodesh Leisiga L'achdu Da'as? Ahumi boyle l'tami shenoga b'kodesh? It's needed for a case of a Tami who touched kodesh. And it's not just Stamakasha that's the mashmas of the pasuk that B'chol Kodesh Leisiga sounds like. It's based on what we see Rish Lakish say somewhere else. The Rish Lakish Taka holds that Tami Shanaga B'Kodesh gets Malkus from this pasuk. The Itmar we learned in Amiroim. Itmar is the equivalent of a Tanya, Braisa for Tanoim. Itmar is for Amiroim. Amiroim have a machlekes. What's the machlekes? Tami Shanaga B'Kodesh. Tami who touched kodesh, touched kachim. Rish Lakish ain't a loiker. Rish Lakish says he gets Malkus for touching kachim. Rabbi Yochanan ain't a loiker. Rabbi Yochanan says he doesn't get Malkus for touching kachim. So what's Taka Pshat? Pshat is we understand that Rish Lakish ain't a loiker B'chol Kodesh Leisiga. Rish Lakish says loiker because B'chol Kodesh Leisiga, the pasuk says B'chol Kodesh Leisiga, you're not allowed to touch kachim. Rabbi Yochanan ain't loiker. Ahu as har l'truma who does. Yochanan, we know why. Yeah, Rabbi Yochanan said B'chol Kodesh Leisiga is talking about truma. It's for standing. But that's not our question. Our focus over is on Rish Lakish. If Yochanan Taka holds B'chol Kodesh Leisiga is for truma, so Taki doesn't have a lab Tami Shanaga B'Kodesh. He only has Tami who ate kodesh from the Gzei Shabbat Tamasa above, which is only talking about the Chi of Karis, which is for Achila. But the question over here is, here we have Rish Lakish telling me that Tami Shanaga B'Kodesh gets Malkus from B'chol Kodesh Leisiga, but you just told me a second ago earlier with the Gemara that B'chol Kodesh Leisiga is for eating kachim. You can't have both. You can't learn both from it, and you can't say it's talking about touching and Kavachoymer eating because it doesn't work like that. You can't get Malkus from a Kavachoymer. So that's the Gemara's kasha. Rish Lakish B'chol Kodesh Leisiga homi boyle Tami Shanaga B'Kodesh, because we learned the Rish Lakish says you get loika for touching hekdesh while being Tami from the pasuk B'chol Kodesh Leisiga, right? So the Gemara answers, yeah, it's Tami Shanaga B'Kodesh. This is the Gemara's answer. Tami Shanaga B'Kodesh mida afki rachmana b'lashon negia. It's like this. We split it up. The lav ba'etzem B'chol Kodesh Leisiga is telling me the ikar you're not allowed to eat. The fact you're not allowed to eat a hekdesh while being Tami. But the fact that the Torah chooses to say in a way of Leisiga is it tells me negia. The Gemara will type choice exactly. Tami Shanaga B'Kodesh mida afki rachmana b'lashon negia. The fact that we learn that Tami Shanaga B'Kodesh is chayav malkus from the fact that the Torah says in no lashon negia B'chol Kodesh Leisiga. If he wanted to just tell me not to eat, could say B'chol Kodesh Leisiga. Now the question is, okay, so if so, maybe it's all talking about not touching kodesh. How do they know they're not allowed to eat kachim from this pasuk? So the Gemara continues. And you have to read the way the back writes it. V'azhara la'oichel iskas. V'azhara la'oichel, yeah? And azhara for someone who's eating is from the fact that iskush kodesh lemikdash. What's pshat iskush kodesh lemikdash? Meaning to say this very passage which says b'chol kodesh leisiga continues by saying ve'lamikdash leisaveh. You compare one to the other, just like ve'lamikdash leisaveh has a kares involved. So too we learn that the azhara, which the passage b'chol kodesh leisiga is primarily talking about, or at least also talking about a situation where there would be kares. And the only kares we ever find by someone who's eating kachim tamid when he eats kachim tumah, not when he touches kachim while being tamid. So therefore, it must be that the pasuk, the kodesh leisiga, isn't just talking about touching truma because there's no kares. From the fact that it's right next to ve'lamikdash leisava, it must be that it's dumya to ve'lamikdash leisava. It's comparable to the case of ve'lamikdash leisava that we're talking about a situation where there's a kares involved, which could only be a situation where you're eating kachim while being tamid. Okay. So now the Gemara continues. Is it really coming to tell me a case of eating kachim while being tamid, and also negir me the after negir, but the primary eating kachim while being tamid? You can't say such a thing. Harumi boile, it's used for a different situation. It's used for goes back dalet. The tamid sha'acha bosa kodesh lifnei zrikas damen. Rish Lakish can't use it for a regular tamei who's eating kachim, which is after zrika. We know that he uses it for before zrika. The itmar, right? We had a maklei because another maklei is Rish Lakish reacting. The itmar tamei sha'achal b'sar kodesh ifnei zrikas damim, a tamei who eats kachim before zrikas damim. Before zrikas damim, no one's really allowed to eat it, right? Not really. No one's allowed to eat it. So it's not mitzad tumah, right? So what happens if a tamei eats before zrikas damim? Rish Lakish says you get Makkos. Just like it was after the zrika, after the carbon's a bona fide carbon. Now the Klein can eat it, but if you're tummy, you can't eat it. So Shlak is saying, no, even before zrika's done, you also get Makkos. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, you don't get Makkos. So now the Gemara explains, since the pasuk is b'chol kodesh leisiga, loishnal ifnei zrika, loishnal actually, it doesn't make a difference between before zrika and after zrika. But Rabbi Yochanan Amar Eina Loika, Rabbi Yochanan says you don't get Makkos. He learns that the whole lab, the whole azhara, like Tommy Shach the Kodesh is learned from Gzei Shabbat Tomasai, the Chiksiv Tomasi la'achaz zrika. Tomasi must be talking about after zrika. Why? Because Tomasai is in the context of kares, which we know is only talking about after zrika. How do we know that there's only kares for after zrika? That's because it's coming by hamshach to kol tar yoichal basa. The pasuk says that Rashi will elaborate, but basically the pasuk is medamet that the Torah is allowed to eat, and if you're tamei and you eat it, then you get then it's a problem. Then v'nichris. So it's clear that we're talking about basa, which is la'achazrika from the Gzei Shabbat Tomas. But just the tight choice, Rish Lakish needs a little bit more beer. What's the kasha? L'chura b'chol kodesh leisiga can tell me both b'fnei zrika and la'achazrika. So the Mefarshim explain, I think Rashi in a different sector, another Rishonim explain that the kasha is like this. We learned earlier how do you know b'chol kodesh leisiga of Rish Lakish refer to eating kachim from the fact that it's next to ve'lamikdash leisaveh. Right? Because and just like ve'lamikdash leisaveh is talking about a situation where there's kares, so to this also must be talking about a situation where there's kares, and it can't be talking about touching kachim, although it says b'chol kodesh leisiga. It can't only be talking about touching; it must also be talking about eating. Now the kares of eating is also only after kares, so the pasuk must be talking primarily about after kares, and therefore, how can you learn it out for lifnei zrika? After zrika where there's kares. How can you tell me it's talking about lifnei zrika as well? If it was another pasuk where we learn after zrika, so you can tell me it's extra pasuk tells me lifnei zrika. But since primarily the pasuk is telling me after zrika, that it's next to abala mikdash tamei, so how do I know lifnei zrika? So the Gemara answers, ahi mibechol kodesh nafka. In other words, it could have just said the kodesh leisiga, don't touch kachim, don't eat kachim. Mikdash leisavim, we know it's talking about not eating kachim. But since it's bechol, all kodesh comes to include even lifnei zrika. Yet primarily it's talking about achazrik. You have to tell me that because it's dumya to ela migdash leisave, which is there's a kares over there, and we know there's only kares for eating kachim achazrikas zrikas adam. But because the pasuk says so, two things. Because the pasuk says loisiga, we know it's also talking about touching. But because it says the word mebechol, that tells me all kachim, even to be marbe lifnei. Okay, let's pause over here for a moment and see Rashi. Up to Rashi, ahu azar litrum. Meaning that when Rabbi Yochanan answered back as to why he holds that there's no Makkos for touching Kachim is because Ahuras are the Truma, Lingias Truma to touching Truma, right? As mentioned earlier, Rabbi Yochanan says B'chol Kodesh Le'Siga is that you're not allowed to touch Truma. Not eating Truma while being Tameh, he learned from the pasuk of Ish Mizera Aaron. Rish Lakish learned Truma from Ish Mizera Aaron and B'chol Kodesh Le'Siga is for Kachim, but Rabbi Yochanan learned both for Truma, one for Negia and one for eating. Okay, so we're just doing the Rashi which says that. Tommy Shinak said the kasha that we had was what would Rish Lakish do? Now the Chura, how can we say Rish Lakish is B'chol Kodesh Le'Siga is for eating kachim while being tamei? Here we have a member of Rish Lakish, and the way the Gemara explains it, that B'chol Kodesh Le'Siga is telling me that there's Malkus that's allowed, you're not allowed to touch kachim. So the Gemara answers, Tommy Shinak Makodesh Tirutzu the Mitaris Rish Lakish, that it's from the Afgrach Mana B'Lashon Negia, and the Achila part is with the Iskish Kodesh Le'Mikdash. The high crime, meaning in this passage, which says B'chol Kodesh Le'Siga, it continues with saying Vela Migdash Le'Savi V'Dashin on the Kamon. We're going to see later the Brisa spells it out. The Rashi is explaining now what's pshat. Ma Migdash Yesh Bazaros in the Tiras Neshama. Just like Beis Hamikdash, there is with regards to someone who comes into the Beis Hamikdash while being Tameh, the Tiras Neshama, meaning this Karish, Abal Hamikdash Tameh B'Karish. Afas Haris Kodesh. So too here when the passage says B'chol Kodesh Le'Siga must also be talking about not having connection, not touching Kachim, which has a Kares, Davish Yesh by Kares, Davish Yesh by Netilas Neshama, which means Kares. The Hainu Achila Shana Shalak Kares. The Ilu B'Negia Laka Kares. Can't just talk about Negia alone because there's no Kares. It must be from the fact that it's next to Lamigdash V'Sav. It must be talking about a type of contact with Kachim, which has Kares, which must be in Achila. The fact that it says Negia means we also. The fact that it says B'chol Kodesh Le'Siga Lashon Negia tells me also Negia, but it must also mean Achila. Okay, Rabbi Yochanan Tamei. Rabbi Yochanan the Tamei. The Omar Azhar LaEichel Kodesh. The Tumasei Nafka Mitumasi Tumasei. Ahuv Tumasei all of the Ksiv Benegeh the Kodesh Achazriku. Right. This is Tumasei is clearly talking about after Zriku because he says the Nick says the time Tois Koinim I seen on Memnachas the Pekshtish Yachud Yuchayavin Ala Mishum Toma. I might think that you chayav for eating kachim before Zrika Kodim Zrika. Tam let me call Tori Chabasa Vanefesh Chabasa. It says call Tori Chabasa then Vanefesh Chabasa gets kares. So it must be that it's talking about when the Torah can eat it, which is la'achazri. So the whole kares. That's how. That's the question is what Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish learns from the pasuk that it also includes Lifnei Zrika, and that's the taka the kasha. That how can it be talking about Lifnei Zrika? Look, we're talking about La'achas Zrika. So the Gemara answers Hu mi b'chol mi Rabbi the b'chol dorish Rish Lakish from the Rabbi of b'chol we learn also Lifnei Zrika. Okay, so now we're just going to finish off the Amud with Tani Kavasa Rish Lakish, meaning to say that it's always good when we find a price which goes like one of the Amiroim. It's good or Takasha, whatever it is, but it's a riot to Rish Lakish where you see that it's not just Makkos Rish Lakish. There's a Brisa which came much before Rish Lakish, which is in accordance, which says exactly what Rish Lakish is saying. What's the Brisa? And here the Brisa spells out the whole Tani Kavasa Rish Lakish B'chol Kodesh Le'Siga Azhar LaOicha. When the pasuk says B'chol Kodesh Le'Siga, not to literally touch kachim, it doesn't mean not to touch kachim while being tamei, or at least it doesn't only mean that. As har la'oicha, really what it's coming to say is that you're not allowed to eat kachim while you're tamei. Now, according to Rish Lakish, according to Rabbi Yochanan, when we talk about truma, so this is already a raya to Rish Lakish, but the Tani Kavas Rish Lakish means the whole Torah of Rish Lakish, how he knows it's talking dafka about oichel and not about negia. Because the Brisa Taich says, how you're telling me that the B'chol Kodesh Le'Siga is telling me you're not allowed to eat kachim while being tamei. Oh, yeah, maybe it's only coming to tell me you're not allowed to touch kachim, and only then there's malchus. Like the Pashto Pshat B'chol Kodesh Le'Siga. So the Talmud B'chol Kodesh Le'Siga Vel Hamikdash. Pasuk B'chol Kodesh Le'Siga straight away says Vel Hamikdash Le'Siga. Makish Kodesh Le'Mikdash. It's makish the lav of B'chol Kodesh Le'Siga not coming into contact with Kodshim while being Tamei Le'Mikdash to the issa of coming into the Beis Hamikdash while being Tamei. Ma Migdash Davish Yesh Ben Netilas Neshama. Just like by Migdash, you always get kares for coming into the Beis Hamikdash. Afkol Davish Yesh Ben Netilas Neshama. So too. The beginning of the passage must also be talking about Davish Yesh by Netilas Neshama, that there's a kares. But even Negia, Ikin Netilas Neshama. If by Negia, there's for sure no kares. Alabachila only by Achil. Okay, let's see Rashi. So here we have a Brisa which is in the first like Rish Lakish Kachol Teiras. The whole Torah of Rish Lakish that B'chol Kodesh Le'Siga is coming to tell me not to eat kachim, not only not to touch kachim, and the reason is because of Azhara Kodesh Le'Mikdash. So let's see. It's a very short Rashi. Tani Rish Lakish. It's 5 lines from the bottom of the page. The Yolif Azhar L'Tami Sha'achas HaKodesh Mivakol Kodesh Le'Siga. That Itaka learns the lav of a Tami eating kachim from B'chol Kodesh Le'Siga. The next Gemara is really not connected to this Gemara, and so we'll stop over here just to quickly, let's just summarize quickly the Amud outside where everything is learned out of. So we have really 4 cases. We have so the beginning part was a Bala Migdash Tameh. So that's clear. The pasuk says it's Mishkan Hashem Timi B'nichus Avaloi Tamas Machneh. So but besides that, we have over here the Mishnah's case of Tami Sha'achal Sakaidesh, Tami who eats kachim, Tami person eats kachim, a Tami person who touches kachim, a Tami person who eats truma, and a Tami person who touches truma. Those are the 4 cases. And then we have another part of a Tami person who eats kachim lifnei zrika sadam. So you have 5 different cases. Let's just go through Shlakish Rabbi Yochanan where each one would learn it out of, or not learn it out of. But let's see. So Tami Sha'achal Sakaidesh, the Tami who eats kachim, Rabbi Yochanan learns it out of Shlakish. Shlakish learns it out of the pasuk B'chol Kodesh Leisiga. And you have to tie choice. It's not just from the fact that it says Leisiga, but the fact that B'chol Kodesh Leisiga V'lamigdash Leisave, it's compared to Lamigdash Leisave. So we know it's talking about somewhere where there's a kares, and therefore it's not just talking about touching kachim. It's also talking about not eating kachim. Rabbi Yochanan learns it out of Gzei Shabbat Tomasai. Says Tomasai by Baal Amigdash Tami. Says Tomasai over here, just like over there. There's Azhar, so over here too. There's Azhar. So that's as far as eating kachim while being tame, touching kachim while being tame. Rish Lakish Taka doesn't have. Rish Lakish said the Afkarak Manav Lashon Negia. Said the Chokodesh Leisiga. Taka, the pasuk talking primarily about not eating, from the fact it's compared to Lamigdash Leisave. But why is it saying open of Leisiga, don't touch it? To tell you that Negia is also allowed. So Rish Lakish will say you get Makkos for that, and is allowed. Rabbi Yochanan will Taka say there's no lav. There's no lav of touching kachim. Now the taka is a problem. You need to keep kachim, but there's no lab, there's no malchus. When we talk about, there's other psukim which imply that you're not allowed to make kachim tameh, not allowed to be metama kachim, but there's no lab of doing it, and therefore taka there's no malchus. The negate to eating truma while being tameh, negate to eating truma while being tameh. Shlakish has a pasuk ishish mizera aaron v'ut sarua izav, and then the pasuk continues by saying v'kachim lo yoicha. Even though it says Bekachim lo yoicha, Rish Lakish says it's talking about truma because Dava Hashava. It says Ishish Mizera Aaron, so we learn that it's something has to be Shava Dafka to unique to Kainim, and Shava Bazar Shal Aaron, meaning Bein Anashim and Nashim, both men Kainim and women Kainim are equal, and the only thing which men and women Kainim are equal in is truma. Otherwise, Kachim only men can eat, and even the type of Kachim that women can eat, not all women can eat. The only type of thing that they're allowed to eat is truma. So therefore, so that's where Rish Lakish learns you're not allowed to eat truma. Rabbi Yochanan learns it from the same pasuk, taka. But what about touching truma? Rish Lakish taka doesn't have a pasuk. Again, you're not allowed to make truma tummy, but there's no lab, there's no malchus. And Rabbi Yochanan will learn touching truma from the pasuk of B'chol Kodesh Leisiga. Okay, so that's basically the thing. We'll stop over here. As Hashem continue Wednesday.